Here in my shed with all this paraphernalia, I'm going to recreate the experiments which changed the world. An experiment done with this prism unlocked a fundamental secret of nature. It gave us science instead of superstition. It showed us a new way of thinking. I'm going to recreate that experiment and go on a journey into the tortured mind of the man who did it.
Dark of the morning, goblins and coming for them from the skies.
No quad A, B, C.
Doesn't buy any books that day.
That man was Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern science. Isaac Newton was an odd character. Antisocial, cantankerous and paranoid, a scientific Victor Meldrew. I've come to Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire to find out why. Newton was born here at the height of the Civil War in 1642, the only child of uneducated, illiterate farmers.
He was a very weak child. When he was brought from birth, he could be carried apparently in a quart pot. I mean, he was a very tiny child. And his father was already dead, and Newton's mother then remarried relatively soon after he was born, and she left him behind when she moved to her new husband's house, and he was brought up by other relatives. So this is a disturbing, if not exactly disturbed, childhood.
His mother abandoned this delicate child when he was just 3 years old. He never got over it. The Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge has an amazing relic from Newton's teenage years. This fragile little notebook is full of his early scrawlings on physics and philosophy, but tucked away at the back is the first sign of his tortured mind. A list of sins he thought he'd committed over the years, a secret memo to God. He wrote in a code which has since been deciphered. 1662. Sin number 13. Threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. Sin 14. Wishing death and hoping it to some. But it gets worse. In another notebook, Newton listed the words that came to mind when he thought of his mother and stepfather.
Father.
Fornicator. Flatterer.
Wife.
Whore.
Years after his mother had left him at the age of 3, Newton still harboured all this anger. I've come to ask Philip Stokoe, a psychoanalyst, what effect this desertion might have had.
Well, at 3 years old, children are becoming very curious about adults and about the grown-up world and about sexuality. So I think that his curiosity became, for him, the explanation as to what had provoked Mother to leave him. And I think that what he did was to organize his curiosity. And by organizing it, he became the first real scientist.
The abandoned child turned away from the fickle world of human beings to the more dependable world of things.
When Newton was a little lad, he became remarkably good at making very intricate little models. He made a windmill, and he was able to make the sails go round with a little mouse he put in it, and he made a kind of little paddle boat, and he turned the wheels with rats, and he made a cart that he could sit in, and he could crank it along with handles there. and he made lots of extraordinary kites. And one time he hung a lantern he'd made to one of his kites, and he was able to see himself to school in the dark of the morning. Fortunately, he completely freaked the neighbours, who assumed it was goblins and coming for them from the skies.
By the time he'd got to King's School, Grantham, where his signature remains carved into this windowsill, he was more fascinated by the world than his schoolwork. He was near the bottom of the class and might have stayed there had it not been for a fight with the school bully. The geekish Newton fought back and won, and he vowed to beat the bully academically too, and he succeeded. Soon he was top of the school. This reaction was typical. Whenever he was challenged, he had to win.
The only thing to do when you're faced with somebody who wants to triumph over you, from his point of view, is to triumph over them. And it has to be total. Anything else is no good. You see, you can't be almost ideal. That doesn't exist as a place.
Yeah.
Either you are the ideal or you're the shit. There's no middle place.
Newton's obsessive curiosity made him a peculiar teenager. One day a storm blew up and he decided to see if the wind affected how far he could jump. He then meticulously measured the distance and compared it to a jump on a calm day. This is our first clue to his compulsive desire to probe and poke into nature's secrets. Newton arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge at the age of 19. He was intellectually superior to the rest of the students and knew it. His arrogance made him no friends, and he was seen as a bit of an oddball.
We'd find a thin, gaunt, unusually tall man with very piercing eyes and a high forehead. Certainly there are lots of stories about him being absent-minded. He'd leave his food uneaten. He'd go for solitary walks in the parks around the college. Extraordinarily studious. He reads voraciously and very self-obsessed.
By now he had the confidence to question the great philosophers. He said, "I am a friend of Plato, I am a friend of Aristotle, but the truth is my greater friend." Newton believed God had created the universe in such a way that the laws of nature ran along mathematical principles.
God is rational, Newton thinks, and there are therefore reasons and purposes which humans, who are also created by God, ought to be able to divine. And special humans should be particularly good at that. And Newton thought he was a special human who could do that using the tools of mathematics and experiment and observation.
This special human turned his mind to every conceivable natural phenomenon. Above all, he was fascinated by God's first creation, light. He believed that light was the closest thing to divine presence on earth. To understand it was to get closer to God. Its allure was irresistible. He began to experiment. He stared at the sun, then shut his eyes and saw an after-image of coloured spots and circles. He did this again and again for a whole afternoon. He was very lucky not to blind himself in the process. And to recover, he lay in a darkened room for 3 days. His next experiment was even more dangerous.
what he did was he took a bodkin, it's apparently a flat needle, and he stuck it in between the eyeball and the bone to alter the curvature of the eyeball to distort the vision. So what would you see if you did that?
I think the first thing that he would have seen would have been double vision, because he would have displaced the two eyes relative to each other and produced a double image. If he'd really gone for it and tried to produce distortion, he would have had to push the bodkin right to the back of the eye, but he may have well progressed to make himself blind in the process of that.
Newton was now convinced that there was some unknown thing in white light which the brain interpreted as colour. He became very excited when, holding a feather up to the sun, colours appeared. But how? A little toy was to give him the answer.
At Starbridge Fair, just outside of Cambridge, Isaac Newton, looking for books, stops at a stall of alchemical trinketry, finds this, a prism. Doesn't buy any books that day, goes home with his prism.
Prisms were sold as amusing toys that made pretty colours from white light, but Newton immediately recognised their potential. He felt that other philosophers who had studied their effect on light had drawn the wrong conclusions.
Do prisms tell us what's really in white light, or do they actually change white light? Descartes and most of the guys in London, the Royal Society, think prisms change white light into colour-making light.
This was the modification theory, and no one questioned it. Isaac Newton, now a 24-year-old postgraduate, had grave doubts about modification theory. Armed with his prism, he was about to formulate an idea so radical it would rock the foundations of the scientific community. Tucked away in Trinity, Newton couldn't wait to start playing with his prism. But in the hot summer of 1665, the Great Plague threatened to spread to Cambridge. The university was closed down and Newton had to go back home to Woolsthorpe. The next 2 years were to be the most productive time of his life. Inspired, allegedly by an apple falling on his head, he started thinking about his theoretical work on gravity and motion, which would occupy his mind in later years. But his immediate project was his revolutionary experiments on light. I've returned to Woolsthorpe with Rob Iliff, a historian of science, who's going to recreate Newton's most important experiment on light, the Experimentum Crucis.
This is almost certainly the room where he did his prism experiments, and you can imagine the light coming in from over here, hitting the prism right by the window and throwing an image onto the wall opposite.
We're following Newton's instructions as closely as possible.
What we're aiming to produce is something like this. What Newton's shown here is the sun coming in through this hole and hitting the prism and making an oblong image on the far side of the wall.
First we're going to drill a hole in a shutter, 1/4 of an inch wide. And all we have to do now is wait for the sun to climb up to the right angle and produce a thin beam of light through our hole.
Okay, this is the first test of this experiment.
Yeah.
And what we have got is a very nice picture of a spectrum on the wall.
As Newton realised, just getting a spectrum of colours proves nothing. Modification theory, which says that a prism changes white light into colours, could explain what we're seeing now. It's the next stage of the experiment that reveals the truth about light.
The next part of the experiment is to get hold of a board.
Yeah.
And the light will appear on
the board.
the board like this.
You're going to make a little hole through where one of those colours is, so that we isolate that colour.
So let's go for, why don't we go for red?
Yeah.
I can get it.
Right,
Okay, there's red.
There's red.
There's
Yeah,
red
red's
there.
going through it.
Red's going through there. Next thing is the second prism. Then we're going to put a second prism behind it and try and make it appear on that wall.
This is the crucis, or crucial part. The modification theory would predict that the second prism would change the red ray back into a rainbow of colours. Newton predicted the red ray would stay red.
They're here.
Okay, there it is, there it is, there, yeah.
Where?
Down the bottom. See?
Oh, yes.
Right.
And it's red.
And it's red.
Right.
And what it shows is that the second prism has refracted the light that's come through the first prism, the red light, and it's retained its colour.
Modification theory is now dead. The ray from the second prism has stayed red, proving that prisms don't change white light into colours. The colours are in the light all along. Each ray colour always bends or refracts to the same angle. And just as he measured his jumping in the wind all those years ago, Newton now used numbers to describe light. It's this use of experiment, measurement and mathematics pioneered by Newton that still defines the scientific method today.
Philosophical Transactions, March the 25th, 1672.
Newton kept his discoveries about light to himself, but using his model-making skills, he applied his new theory to a practical problem: the telescope.
An account of a new kind of telescope invented by Mr. Isaac Newton. Here's an old kind of telescope invented sometime before Mr. Isaac Newton had a shop. And this is a refracting telescope. These are lenses it's using. And so the white light splits up into its colours and you get chromatic aberration around your image. Here's Mr. Isaac Newton's job. Look at this little chap here, right? And yeah, look through this. He's used mirrors, do you see? So the white light doesn't refract and break up. There we are, look at that. No chromatic aberration, no fuzz. It's just wickedly spot on. And look at that, same magnification. I see better magnification. Look at the size, so much smaller.
A Cambridge professor persuaded Newton to show his reflecting telescope at the Royal Society. The elite of the scientific community were mightily impressed.
Then the secretary of the Royal Society, a man named Henry Oldenburg, writes to Newton and says, "That was pretty good. Show us what else you can do." And Newton then sends to Oldenburg a letter.
Up until then, the Royal Society journal, Philosophical Transactions, had been filled with whimsical observations on werewolves, two-headed calves, and accounts of how to make insects out of cheese. Newton's letter, on the other hand, was scientific, serious, and the first time in the journal's history a major theory had been overturned.
We're now in February 1672, in which Newton describes, in a very careful, very ingenious, very well-judged way, what he's been doing with prisms and colours and light. And when that letter reaches London, all hell breaks loose.
A discourse of Mr. Isaac Newton containing his new theory about light and colours sent...
Every theory had to be approved by the curator of experiments, none other than the champion of modification theory, the hunchbacked Robert Hooke. Hooke spent a mere 3 hours analysing Newton's theory. His report began...
I confess I cannot see yet any undeniable argument to convince me of the certainty thereof.
Newton, petulant and pompous, wrote back saying, his theory is as certain a truth as I have asserted it. But Hooke persisted in his criticism.
Hooke didn't see why that theory followed from these experiments, so he called Newton's theory a hypothesis, a model, and then Newton went ballistic.
Newton fought back aggressively, accusing Hooke of being an amateur and failing to understand his scientific method. It was the schoolyard all over again. But this time it would take him much longer to beat the bully. He returned to Cambridge to orchestrate his revenge. Seething with anger, he cut himself off from the scientific community and concentrated on perfecting the work he'd started at Woolsthorpe, keeping to himself the great advances he was making in optics and mathematics. As a Cambridge professor, he had to give regular lectures, but he made his highly technical, and he refused to dumb his science down for lesser intellects, i.e. everybody else.
Pono quad A, B, C. Sit prisma.
The students quickly became bored, and after the first lecture, the greatest scientist ever dispensed his wisdom to an empty room.
Focus est ad distantem semipedis.
Eventually, 15 years after his fight with Hooke began, Newton hit back with his masterwork, the Principia Mathematica. This remarkable book contains his theories on gravity and mechanics, universal laws which remain the very bedrock of modern engineering and science. There's also a complete description of time, space and motion. His critics were stunned by its brilliance. Once again, Newton was top of the class.
He's such an overwhelming figure. He towers above everyone else. It's impossible to forget what's going to happen next. Because what's going to happen next is the Newtonian century. This age when Newtonian natural philosophy, the theory of light and colour, the theory of motion, the theory of the planetary system, the whole theory of mechanics will triumph.
Newton's genius allowed him to triumph in unlocking the secrets of nature. But when it came to people, he was a dismal failure. He'd had few friends and never had a lover. He died in 1727 at the age of 85, antisocial and cantankerous to the last.